I never expected to be afraid of a person who offered me tea. That sounds like a strange way to begin a report to the Zethari High Council. But I have learned, after 9 months on Earth, that the strange things are usually the true ones. So I will begin there, with the tea, and with Sergeant Claire Rios, and with the 11 seconds that changed everything I thought I understood about this planet, and the species that lives on it. I arrived at the Earth Liaison Office on a Tuesday. Humans care very much about what day of the week it is, which I found odd at first, and then found quietly admirable. They have divided their time into small pieces and named each one, which is either the behavior of a species with excellent organizational instincts, or a species that has spent a very long time surviving things, and needed to mark the days, just to prove they had made it through another one. I now believe it is both. The Conclave dossier on humans described them as follows: soft-bodied, bilaterally symmetrical, warm-blooded, with a lifespan of approximately 70 to 90 planetary cycles. Emotional, frequently irrational, highly social. Prone to conflict with members of their own species, which the dossier flagged as a destabilizing trait. Technologically advancing at a rate classified as moderate. Military capability classified as developing. Threat level low. I had read that file 4 times before landing. I felt prepared. Claire Rios was waiting for me at the arrival terminal. She was not what I expected, though I am not entirely sure what I expected. She was of average height for a human female, with dark hair pulled back tightly, wearing a plain gray uniform with a small emblem on the shoulder. She was not large. She was not visibly armed. She looked, if I am being honest, quite ordinary. She shook my hand, a human greeting ritual involving the pressing together of upper limb extremities, and told me her name, her rank, and that she had been assigned as my escort and liaison contact for the duration of my posting. She said this in a calm, even voice, the way someone might describe the weather. Then she picked up one of my carrying cases before I could protest and walked toward the transit corridor, without looking back. I followed her, because there was nothing else to do. The Earth Transit Hub was overwhelming. I had been briefed on human population density, but reading about it and standing inside it are very different experiences. There were thousands of them, moving in every direction at once, and the noise was remarkable. They talked, and played sound from small devices, and called out to each other across the crowds, and the whole space hummed with a kind of constant low energy that I did not know how to classify. Rios moved through it without any apparent effort. She did not push, she did not slow down. She seemed to read the crowd the way I might read a simple text, finding gaps before they appeared, adjusting her path with tiny shifts that I barely noticed. Her hands, I noticed, were always slightly away from her sides, not in a threatening way, just available, ready. I filed it away as a habit. A tick, perhaps. We were about halfway through the main transit hall when it happened. A Dreth merchant, I would learn later, had been having a dispute with a customs official about the classification of certain goods he had brought to sell. The dispute had escalated. By the time I registered and anything was happening, the merchant had produced a plasma cutting tool from somewhere in his outer garments and was holding it in a way that was not consistent with its intended purpose. The crowd reacted the way crowds do. A surge away from the source of the disturbance, sound rising sharply, people colliding with each other. I was nearly knocked sideways. I registered alarm in the way my species does, which involves a rapid cooling of the extremities and a strong instinct to locate an exit. I turned to look for Rios. She was already moving toward the disturbance, not running, not drawing a weapon, just moving, purposefully, at a pace that closed distance faster than it looked like it should. 2 humans who had been standing near a refreshment counter fell into step slightly behind her, one to each side. They had not spoken to each other. I did not see a signal pass between them. They simply went. What happened next? I watched from approximately 12 meters away, and I have reviewed my personal recording of it 6 times since. I still find it difficult to describe with precision. Rios and the 2 civilians reached the Dreth merchant. There was a brief interaction. The plasma cutter was no longer a factor after approximately 4 seconds. The merchant was on the floor after approximately 8 seconds. He was unhurt. He was simply not going anywhere. At 11 seconds, Rios was standing upright, smoothing the front of her uniform, and the 2 civilians who had joined her were already walking calmly back toward where they had come from. Neither of the 2 civilians was in uniform. One of them was carrying a small bag that I later saw contained groceries. Security personnel arrived at the scene approximately 40 seconds after the incident began. There was nothing left for them to do except file a report. I walked to where Rios was standing. My legs felt strange. She was watching the security officers work and drinking from a small container of the hot beverage she had picked up. Before we left the arrival terminal, I asked her which unit the two civilians belonged to. She looked at me with a mildly puzzled expression. Transit Authority, she said. Civilian response. They do safety training once a month. Most of the regulars around here know the drill. I asked what the training involved. She shrugged. Situational awareness, crowd control basics, a bit of restraint technique. She took another sip of her drink. Do you want some tea? The stand over there does a decent enough job. I said yes. I needed something to do with my hands. We sat at a small table near the far wall, while the scene behind us was cleaned up and documented. Rios answered my questions patiently. She told me the two civilians who had helped her were named Gordon Webb and Penny Lake. Gordon worked at a materials supply company. Penny was a school teacher who had been shopping on her day off. They had both done the same half-day safety course that the Transit Authority offered free of charge to anyone who used the hub regularly. I asked if it was common for civilians to intervene in situations like that. Rios thought about it for a moment. Depends on the person, she said. Some people freeze, some people run. Some people just step in. It varies. Gordon's always been the stepping-in type. Known him 4 years. Never seen him hesitate. I looked across the hall at the spot where, 40 minutes earlier, a Dreth merchant with a plasma cutting tool had been neutralized in 11 seconds by a soldier and a schoolteacher on her day off. Is that considered normal? I asked. What just happened here? Rios looked at me for a moment. I could not read her expression, then she said, for us? Pretty much, yeah. That night, sitting alone in my assigned quarters in the liaison building, I sent an urgent query to the Conclave's Central Archive. I asked for the complete file on Earth's military specialist units, the ones their own documentation referred to as Special Forces. I had assumed, based on the dossier classification of low threat, that I was asking out of idle curiosity. The archive returned a partial response in 6 hours. The full file, it told me, required level 9 clearance. I held level 5. It had never occurred to me that I would need more than that for an assignment to a developing world with a low threat rating. The partial response alone contained enough to keep me awake until the Earth sky turned pale with morning light. There was one passage in particular. It was from an internal memo written by a Conclave survey officer who had visited Earth 14 years earlier, during the preliminary contact period. He had been watching a human training exercise and had written down his observations in clinical language, the way a trained observer should. But at the end, the language changed slightly. He wrote, "There is something in the way they train that does not fit our models. They are not preparing for war the way a soldier prepares. They are preparing the way a species prepares that has never since known a time when the danger was not there. The baseline from which they train is already above what we would consider an exceptional outcome." I read that sentence 3 times, then I got dressed and went to find Rios. She was at her desk, apparently untroubled by the previous day's events, eating something from a small container and reviewing a schedule on her screen. I asked her if she had ever been in what she would call a dangerous situation. She looked up at me. Before the job. She thought about it the way a person thinks about a shopping list, running through items. Couple of altercations when I was younger, she said. Warhode fire near my neighborhood when I was about 19. I helped get some people out. There was a flooding incident a few years back, helped with some evacuation work. She paused. Oh, and my brother broke his arm pretty badly on a camping trip once, a few hours from the nearest road. I had to stabilize it and hike us both out. She said all of this in the same tone she had used to describe the transit incident the day before. The tone of someone describing something that happened, not something that defined them. I thanked her and went back to my desk. I sat there for a long time, looking at the city outside the window, watching humans move through their ordinary morning, and trying to figure out exactly what question I needed to ask next. I had a feeling it was a very important one. The answer arrived, piece by piece, over the following 3 weeks. I worked within my clearance level, which meant I was working with fragments. The full picture was locked behind doors I could not open. But fragments, if you gather enough of them and hold them up to the right light, begin to show you the shape of what they came from. And the shape I was beginning to see was not what the Conclave had told me to expect. The first fragment came from the Open Academic Database. I was looking for context on human physiological responses to stress, trying to understand what I had seen in Rios and in the 2 civilians at the transit hub. What I found was a body of research so large it took me the better part of a day just to sort through the index. Humans had been studying themselves intensively for a very long time. They found themselves endlessly interesting, which I had initially classified as vanity. I was revising that assessment. It was not vanity, it was vigilance. They wanted to understand exactly what they were capable of, and they were remarkably honest about it, including the parts that were uncomfortable. The research on stress response was particularly striking. Most species in the conclave, my own included, exhibit predictable responses to perceived mortal danger. The nervous system floods with chemical signals. Fine motor control degrades, decision-making slows. The body prepares to run or to go still. This is sensible biology. When you are smaller than the thing trying to harm you, stillness or speed are your options. Human biology does all of this too, technically. But there is an additional layer. A significant portion of the human population exhibits what their researchers call a focused state response to high-danger situations. A narrowing of attention, an increase in processing speed, a reduction in pain sensitivity, and an apparent suppression of the fear response itself. Not all humans, the studies were careful about that, but enough of them that the researchers treated it as a statistically meaningful trait, not an outlier. The thing that held my attention longest was not the trait itself. It was the description of how it is distributed. It is not clustered in military families, or in people with violent histories, or in any demographic that would suggest it is an acquired response. It appears, the study said, relatively evenly across the general population, somewhat higher in people who have experienced significant early adversity, but present in some measure in ordinary people living ordinary lives. I thought about Penny Lake, the schoolteacher with the groceries, who had stepped forward without hesitation. I thought about Gordon Webb, who had apparently been doing this for 4 years, with no more formal preparation than a half-day safety course. I kept reading. The second fragment came from a historical archive I accessed through the Public Diplomatic Library. I was not looking for military history. I was looking for context on human social structures, trying to understand why they organized themselves the way they did. But the military history found me anyway. Because for humans, the two things are deeply intertwined in a way that is unlike almost any other species the conclave has catalogued. Human civilization did not develop in safety. This is not unusual. Most species climb out of some form of environmental hardship. But the scale and duration of what humans climbed out of was unusual. For the vast majority of their history as a species, they were not the most dangerous thing in their environment. They were mid-sized, slow compared to their predators with poor night vision and no natural armor. What they had was a brain that could plan ahead, hands that could make tools, and a social structure that allowed them to coordinate in groups. The groups are what made the difference, their historians said. A single human is not particularly alarming. A group of humans who have decided to do something together is a different matter entirely. But here is the part that began to unsettle me, the further I read. The danger humans adapted to was not just predators. It was each other. For a very long time, the most lethal threat to any group of humans was another group of humans. They fought over resources, over territory, over ideas, over things that were not resources and not territory but that felt as vital as both. This went on for so long, and was so consistent a feature of their existence, that it stopped being an aberration and became a pressure, an evolutionary pressure. The third fragment came from a conversation. I had been in the liaison building for nearly 2 weeks at this point, and I had begun to recognize the rhythms of the place. The humans who worked there were a varied group. Some were military like Rios. Some were civilian administrative staff. Some were scientists or cultural specialists assigned to the diplomatic function. They ate together in a shared space at midday, and they talked. And after a while they began to include me in the conversations in the tentative, considerate way that I was learning was characteristic of humans when they were genuinely trying to be welcoming. One afternoon I found myself sitting across from a man named Owen Dale. He was a civilian, structural engineer who had been brought on to advise on building compatibility for the liaison offices. He was tall, with a quiet manner, and he had a habit of drawing small diagrams on paper while he talked, even when the diagrams were not relevant to the conversation. We talked about architecture for a while, then about his work, then somehow, about a period he had spent about 10 years earlier doing volunteer work in a part of the world that had experienced a significant natural disaster. He spent 14 months there, he said, helping rebuild infrastructure. He described it in the same matter-of-fact tone that Rios used for everything. I asked him if it had been dangerous. He tilted his head slightly. Parts of it, he said. There was some instability in the region at the time. We had a few close calls. He drew a small square on his paper and added a roof to it. But the work needed doing and people needed the help. I asked if he had any training for working in unstable environments. He smiled slightly. Not really, you pick things up, you pick things up. I wrote that in my notes that evening and underlined it. not because it was a shocking statement, but because of how unremarkable he made it sound. He had gone, untrained, to a dangerous place for 14 months because work needed doing. And then he had come home and gone back to being a structural engineer who drew small diagrams while talking. And he mentioned it the way someone mentions a trip they had once taken. I contacted the archive again that night. I had not expected to find anything new within my clearance level. But the archive had flagged a newly declassified summary from the Conclave's Xenopsychology Board. It was old, predating first contact by several decades, compiled from long-range observation data. The summary was 20 pages. I read it twice before I fully understood what I was looking at. The board had been tasked with assessing potential contact species across a range of characteristics. For most species, the assessment was fairly straightforward. You measured capability against some proxy metrics, estimated intent, and filed a report. Earth had been different. Earth had caused what the board described in careful academic language as a significant discussion. The specific point of discussion was not the military. It was not Earth's weapons technology or its strategic capability. Those were both rated as developing and were not considered remarkable at the contact period level. The discussion was about the baseline. Every species has what the board called a civilian baseline, the typical capability level of an ordinary member of the population, the ones with no special training, no combat role, no particular aptitude for physical threat response. For most species, this baseline is low, as you would expect. Most individuals in any sapient civilization are not trained for conflict. They are farmers, scholars, builders, merchants, carers. For humans, the board had found that the civilian baseline was anomalous. Not dramatically, not in a way that produced alarming numbers on any single metric, but consistently, across a range of assessed factors: stress tolerance, improvised problem solving, physical endurance relative to body size, and willingness to engage with dangerous situations rather than withdraw from them. The ordinary human civilian scored significantly above what the board's models predicted. The board's note on this was written in the careful, measured language of scientific caution. It said, "The civilian baseline may reflect a population-level normalization of traits that in other species appear primarily in specialized subpopulations. If accurate, this would suggest that human society has, over time, distributed capabilities that other species concentrate in specific roles across the general population. The implications of this for threat modeling require further study." Further study had apparently been recommended 40 years ago. I was not sure how much of it had been done. I thought about Penny Lake. I thought about Owen Dale and his small diagrams. I thought about Rios moving through the crowd the way a person moves through familiar terrain. Hands always slightly ready, always knowing where the space was going before it opened. And then I thought about the Level 9 seal on the Special Forces file, and I tried to imagine what was inside it, and whether the gap between the ordinary humans I had been meeting and whatever was in that file was as large as the Conclave seemed to think it was. I was not sure it was. The request for a clearance upgrade went to the Conclave liaison office the next morning. I expected it to take weeks. I expected a formal review, committee deliberation, the slow grind of institutional caution. It took 4 days. Something was already in motion by then. Something that had not yet reached me through official channels, but that I was beginning to feel the edges of, the way you feel a change in air pressure before the weather changes. A tension, a quickening. I would understand it fully soon enough. On the 5th day after I submitted the clearance request, I received a message that it had been approved. On the 6th day, a Dreth observation team landed at the transit hub. On the 7th day, everything I had been slowly learning came together in a single, extraordinary 90 seconds that I will spend the rest of my career trying to describe accurately to people who were not there. I want to be precise about what happened, because precision matters when the events are unlikely and the stakes are serious. I have reviewed my personal recording multiple times. I have compared notes with 2 other witnesses. I am as confident as I can be that what I am about to describe is accurate. The Dreth Consolidation had requested permission to send an observer delegation to the quarterly conclave summit being held at the Earth Liaison Complex. This was not unusual. Observer delegations attend these summits regularly. They sit in on the open sessions, receive briefing materials, and generally participate in the diplomatic processes that keep the various conclave members in reasonable communication with each other. What the Dreth sent was not, in any normal sense of the word, an observer delegation. There were 12 of them. They arrived in full tactical configuration, which for Dreth means articulated body armor covering approximately 80% of the body surface, integrated communication arrays, and equipment harnesses carrying tools that had multiple possible uses, some of them peaceful and some of them not. They moved in a formation that any experienced security professional would recognize immediately. It was a display, a demonstration of capability in a formal setting, dressed up as an official visit. Diplomats do not move in tactical formation. Soldiers do. The conclave has an informal name for this kind of visit. They call it a presence demonstration. It is a way of reminding a newer or smaller party of a negotiation that there is a significant difference in physical capability between the two sides, without technically doing anything hostile. Most species respond to a presence demonstration by becoming more accommodating. It is unpleasant but effective. Rios met them at the entrance. She was in her standard uniform alone, and she stood with her hands at her sides and her expression politely neutral while the Dreth formation came to a stop in front of her. Their team leader was a large individual, considerably taller than Rios, wearing the rank insignia of a decorated veteran. He looked down at her the way someone looks at something that is slightly in the way. I was watching from the corridor to the left of the main entrance. I had been on my way to a briefing and had paused when I saw the Dreth coming in. My own instinct, I am not ashamed to admit, was to locate a room with a lockable door. I did not do this, but the instinct was present and strong. Rios said something to the Dreth team leader. I was too far away to hear it, he responded. She nodded once, slowly, and said something else. I do not know exactly what she said. I have since asked her, and she told me she informed them that they would need to secure their equipment harnesses in the provided lockboxes before entering the complex, as per the standard security protocol for all visitors. She said she explained this politely and clearly, and offered to help with the process if they needed assistance. The Dreth team leader apparently did not receive this well. What happened next was very fast. I have tried to slow it down in my memory the way you slow down a recording, frame by frame. It does not fully cooperate. Fast things that are also complex tend to resist orderly recollection. The Dreth team leader made a movement that was not consistent with compliance. It was not quite an attack, but it was not nothing either. It was the kind of movement that is designed to communicate that compliance is not on the table, and that the person you are speaking to should reconsider their position. Rios did not reconsider her position. She moved in a way that I find genuinely difficult to describe to someone who has not seen a highly trained human operate at speed. It was not dramatic. There were no sudden shouts or aggressive gestures. It was more like watching someone make a very precise correction, the way a pilot adjusts course, smooth and without hesitation. And the result was that the Dreth team leader's movement went nowhere and produced no effect, and he was standing very still with a slightly confused expression. The rest of the Dreth formation began to react. This is the moment where I lost clean track of the sequence, because several things were happening at once. There were 6 other humans in the main entrance corridor. I had not been paying particular attention to them before this moment. 2 were from the complex's security staff in uniform posted near the secondary doors. One was a man in a civilian jacket who I had seen in the building several times and had assumed was an administrative contractor. One was a woman from the catering staff who had been moving a cart of refreshment supplies toward the summit room. One was a young man I had never seen before who appeared to be delivering packages. One was a facilities technician who had been doing something to a panel on the far wall. All 6 of them moved at approximately the same moment that the Dreth formation began to react. Not all of them moved the same way. The 2 security staff moved with clear professional purpose, exactly as their training would dictate. The man in the civilian jacket moved with a kind of controlled speed that told me, within about 2 seconds, that he was not actually an administrative contractor. The catering woman stepped forward and to the right, placing herself at an angle that I recognized, from my reading of the past few weeks, as a positional choice rather than an accidental one. She was blocking a path of movement. She had done this before, or had thought very carefully about how to do it, or both. The delivery man and the facilities technician moved to create distance and position, and neither of them looked confused or frightened, which told me a great deal. The Dreth formation, which had been designed to project overwhelming physical presence, found itself in contact with 7 humans who responded to its movement, not with accommodation or retreat, but with calm, efficient redirection. 90 seconds. That is how long the entire sequence took. From the moment Rios finished her first sentence to the moment the Dreth team leader was sitting on the floor looking at the humans around him, with an expression that I recognized from my study of their cultural archives as profound re-evaluation. No one was seriously hurt. The Dreth were not harmed in any meaningful way. They were simply and completely stopped, and they knew it. And everyone present knew it. And the silence that followed was one of the most communicative silences I have encountered in my entire diplomatic career. The Dreth team leader was a veteran of 4 documented armed conflicts. He had received the Consolidation's highest military commendation twice. He had, according to intelligence his delegation had filed with the Conclave, spent 30 years in operational roles of escalating intensity. He was not a person who was accustomed to finding himself sitting on the floor with no clear path forward. Surrounded by opponents who were not breathing hard, he looked at Rios. Then he looked at the catering woman, who had returned to her cart and was straightening the supplies on it with a matter-of-fact efficiency. Then he looked at the man in the civilian jacket, who had stepped back and was quietly speaking into a communication device. Then he looked at the delivery man, who was picking up the packages he had set down, and seemed to be calculating how long his route would take. The Dreth team leader, for the first time since he had arrived, was very quiet. Rios asked him again about the equipment harnesses. He complied. I helped process the security forms, because that was my job and my hands needed something to do. Rios stood nearby, answering questions from the arriving security supervisor with the same even voice she used for everything. At some point, the catering woman came by with a tray of small drinks, because the summit was beginning and refreshments were part of the schedule, and she offered one to me with a pleasant smile. I took it and drank it, and tried to look like someone for whom this was a normal morning. Later, after the summit had convened, and the Dreth delegation was seated in the observers' gallery, looking considerably less comfortable than they had on arrival, I found a quiet corner of the corridor, and sat down and went through my notes from the previous weeks. Penny Lake, schoolteacher; Gordon Webb, material supply; Owen Dale, structural engineer; Rios, soldier; the catering woman; the delivery man; the facilities technician. I had been thinking about the Special Forces file all week. Level 9 clearance, sealed, 3 species in the Conclave sharing that classification. I had been building up the sealed file in my mind as the explanation. The thing that would tell me what I was looking at when I looked at humans. The thing behind the thing, the dangerous part. Sitting in that corridor, I started to wonder if I had been looking in the wrong direction. The catering woman was not Special Forces. Neither was Gordon Webb or Owen Dale or Penny Lake. They were not trained in any extraordinary way, not selected for any particular capability, not part of any classified program. They were civilians, doing civilian things, who had simply responded to a situation in a way that their species at the population level apparently responds to situations. The Special Forces file was sealed at level 9. But I was sitting in a building where the catering staff knew instinctively how to move to block a path of approach, and I was beginning to understand that these were not 2 separate facts. They were the same fact, seen from different distances. I sent a new request to the archive that evening, not for the Special Forces file, though I still wanted that. I asked instead for the full Xenopsychology Board report, the complete one, not the declassified summary, the one from 40 years ago, the one that had prompted the concern about the baseline, the one that had apparently been sitting in the level 9 section long enough to gather considerable institutional dust. I said in my request that I believed it was directly relevant to current events. The approval came back in 3 hours. I started reading at 9 in the evening, Earth time. I did not stop until the sun came up. I sat in the quiet of the empty briefing room, with a cup of cooling tea, and read 4,000 pages. And by the time the morning light came through the windows, I had the shape of the whole thing, and I understood, with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable, why the Dreth team leader had looked at the humans around him the way he had. It was not because he had seen something he did not expect. It was because he had understood, too late, what he was looking at. The Xenopsychology Board report began with a note on methodology that would have seemed dry and technical to most readers. I found it arresting. The board's chairperson had written that the challenge with Earth was not gathering data. The challenge was knowing what to do with data that did not fit the standard framework. In the standard framework, the board assessed species along several axes. Technological development was one. Social organization was another. Military capability was a third, always treated carefully, always measured against intent and context. But the axis that mattered most, the one that the board returned to again and again in the report's 4,000 pages, was something they called adaptive distribution. Adaptive distribution is the board's term for how a species spreads its survival-relevant traits across its population. Most species concentrate these traits. They develop castes, or roles, or selection processes that identify individuals with particular capabilities and move them into positions where those capabilities can be used. The rest of the population develops in other directions. This is efficient. It means your soldiers are very good at being soldiers, and your farmers are very good at being farmers, and the two populations develop along their separate lines. The board had found this pattern in every species they had assessed. Without exception, until Earth. Humans have castes and roles. They have soldiers and farmers and scholars and all the rest of it. But their survival-relevant traits do not stay neatly in the soldier category. They spread. They have spread so thoroughly, over so many thousands of years of environmental and social pressure, that the board found it genuinely difficult to draw a clean line between the trained population and the civilian population on certain key metrics. Physical endurance was one. The board's data showed that ordinary human civilians, with no particular training, maintained endurance levels that the board's models associated with trained soldiers in other species. This was partly biology and partly cultural, because humans have built physical challenge into their leisure activities to a degree that no other species in the conclave does. They run distances for recreation. They climb mountains because the mountains are there. They do not do this because someone told them to. They do it because a significant portion of them are drawn to difficulty the way other species are drawn to comfort. And this is not pathology, the board was careful to note. It is adaptation. Pain tolerance was another. The board was very careful here, very measured, not wanting to overstate. But the data was clear. Average human pain tolerance sat well above the conclave average, and this was not because humans lacked nociception. They feel pain as acutely as any species. It was because their relationship with pain, on a cultural and psychological level, was different. They had built systems for managing it, for working through it, for treating it as information rather than as a stop signal. Their medicine, their sports culture, their working traditions, their plain everyday attitudes toward hardship, all of it expressed a species that had made a long-term decision about pain, and the decision was that it would not be the final word. The focus state response I had found in the academic database was addressed at length in the board's report. They called it task priority override, which is a more precise way of saying the same thing. In conditions of severe stress, some humans override their own fear response and shift into a state of focused action. The board's assessment, based on the data they had gathered through remote observation, was that this trait was present in a significantly higher proportion of the human population than in any other assessed species, and that it appeared at meaningful levels across the civilian population, not just in trained individuals. But the section that I came back to most, the section that I reread 3 times and then sat with in silence, was the section on group behavior. Most of the traits I have described so far are individual. They describe what a single human does under pressure. The board's group behavior section described what happens when humans face a threat together. And it was a different order of finding. In most species, group cohesion under threat is a trained behavior. It requires rehearsal, established command structures, clear protocols. Without training, groups tend to fragment under pressure. Individuals act on individual instinct. Coordination breaks down. This is not a failing. It is simply what biology does when it has not been specifically prepared. In humans, something different happened with striking regularity. The board had observed it in historical records, in disaster response documentation, in the accounts of researchers who had embedded in human communities facing crisis. When a group of humans faces a threat together, even a group with no particular training and no established structure, a coordination process emerges. It is not perfectly efficient, it is not as clean as trained coordination, but it appears spontaneously, and it is more effective than the board's models predicted it should be for an untrained group. Individuals take on roles without being assigned them. The person with the most relevant skill moves to the relevant position. Others support, or create space, or handle the parts of the problem that the central actor cannot address. The group thinks together in a way that is faster than verbal communication should allow. As though the shared experience of the threat activates a channel that runs alongside normal interaction. The board's note on this was cautious, as good science should be, but it did not hide what the data showed. It said, human group behavior under threat exhibits spontaneous self-organization at a level not observed in other assessed species. The mechanism is not fully understood. It may involve a combination of high individual threat sensitivity, extensive cultural modeling of cooperative behavior in adversity, and long-term evolutionary reinforcement of coordination responses. Whatever the mechanism, the outcome is consistent. Groups of humans facing threats perform above what individual capability metrics would predict. I thought about the entrance corridor, Rios and the 6 others. The catering woman moving to block a path without anyone telling her to. The delivery man stepping to create position. The security staff and the man in the civilian jacket converging on the center. No plan, no briefing, no signal I had seen, just a group of humans and a threat and 90 seconds. The board's final section was a recommendations page. It was brief, relative to what came before it, and it was written with the careful language of people who understood that what they were recommending was unusual. The core recommendation was this: the standard threat modeling framework should not be applied to Earth without modification. The framework assumes that a species' threat potential is concentrated in its trained military population, with civilian populations representing a lower tier. This assumption does not hold for Earth. The civilian baseline represents a starting point that is meaningfully higher than the conclave average, and the trained military population should be understood as what develops when that starting point is refined, selected, and further developed through intensive preparation. In practical terms, the threat assessment that matters is not what Earth's military can do. It is what Earth's population as a whole represents. These are not the same number. There was a follow-up recommendation that had been added a few years later, in a brief addendum, by a different board member. It was 2 sentences. The first said that after further review of accumulating data, the original recommendation stood and should be considered urgent. The second sentence said, "We wish to note that this assessment is not a basis for alarm. Consistent data indicates that humans are not an expansionist species, not a predatory species in any cultural sense, and not inclined toward unprovoked aggression. They are, however, a species that responds to threat with a level of capability that the conclave should not be surprised by, and it would be a significant error to interpret their general cooperative friendliness as an indicator of their capacity in other situations." I closed the report. Outside the window, Earth's sun was fully up now, and I could see the courtyard where, in a few hours, the summit delegates would take their midday break and humans would move among them, offering refreshments, making polite conversation, asking curious and genuinely interested questions about species they had never met before. The Dreth delegation would be there. The team leader, who had sat on the floor of the entrance corridor the previous morning, with the expression of a soldier realizing he had miscalculated something fundamental, would be there. He had been very quiet since the incident. His body language, which I had spent enough time around humans to read a little, was the language of a person revising assumptions. I hoped his revision was thorough. Mine certainly was. I began drafting a message to the Zethari Council. I wrote the opening line, deleted it, and wrote it again. The challenge was that the most accurate summary of what I had found was also the most alarming sounding, and I did not want to alarm the Council prematurely. I wanted them to understand what I understood, and what I understood was more complicated than a threat rating. I would need several more days to write it properly. The events of the morning had given me the final pieces, but the picture they completed was a large one, and I wanted to be sure I described it clearly. I poured the rest of my cold tea into a disposal container and went to find something hot. On my way to the commissary, I passed the entrance corridor. It was quiet now, ordinary, no trace of what had happened there the previous morning, except a very faint scuff on the floor near the main door. A maintenance worker was buffing it out with a hand tool, humming quietly to himself. He looked up as I passed and gave me a polite nod. I nodded back and kept walking. I want to tell you how I finished writing that report to the Zethari Council, and what I said in it, and why I chose every word as carefully as I did. But before I get to that, I need to tell you about a conversation I had with Rios, 3 days after the summit incident, because that conversation was the thing that made the report possible to write honestly. It was an afternoon with nothing scheduled. The summit had concluded, the delegations had dispersed, and the complex had returned to the quieter pace of its normal operation. I found Rios in the small outdoor area on the building's east side, sitting on a low wall, reading something on a flat handheld device. She looked up when I sat down nearby. We talked first about ordinary things. The weather, which was overcast and cool, a report she had filed, a delivery of new equipment that had arrived with 2 items mislabeled. Human conversation has a great deal of this kind of preamble, and I had grown to appreciate it. It is not meaningless. It is a way of establishing the register of a conversation, of saying, before anything serious is said, that the 2 speakers are on comfortable enough terms to say serious things. When the preamble had run its course, I asked her the question that had been sitting at the back of everything for 3 days. I asked her what it felt like, not the mechanics, not the training, what it actually felt like from the inside to respond the way she responded, to move towards something that every reasonable instinct would classify as a reason to move away. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the device in her hands without reading it. I don't know that I feel it the way you might expect, she said finally. It's not like a decision exactly. Not like choosing. It's more like the situation becomes simple. Everything that isn't the problem stops mattering, and the problem is just the problem. And there's a next step and then another next step. She paused. Does that make sense? I told her it made a great deal of sense, actually. That it mapped quite closely to what I had been reading. The focusing thing, she said. Yeah, they study that. She set the device down on the wall beside her. I didn't know what it was for a long time. When I was younger, I thought something was wrong with me. That I was reacting to things the wrong way. Other people seemed to get scared in a more obvious way than I did. She glanced at me. I do get scared. I want to be clear about that. It's just that the scared and the action don't fight each other the way I think they do for some people. I asked her if she thought this was unusual, among humans. She thought about it. Not particularly, she said. Different people have it in different amounts. Some people it shuts down completely under pressure, they freeze. Some people it disappears almost entirely. Most people are somewhere in the middle. But the thing you saw at the transit hub, with Gordon and Penny, that's not special. They're not specially trained people. They just stepped in because stepping in was the right thing, and they were the people who were there. I asked if they had talked about it afterward. If they had processed it, debriefed, sought any kind of support. Rios gave me a look that I had come to recognize as gentle amusement. Gordon texted me that evening to ask if I needed any paperwork done. Penny sent a message to the hub's community board, saying the safety training session needed a refresher on 2 specific restraint techniques because they'd been slightly awkward. She paused. They were both fine. They're both always fine. They were both always fine. I wrote that down in my notes and then sat with it. We talked for another hour, about things that were partly personal and partly professional. She told me about her family, a subject humans always approach with a particular kind of warmth that I find very distinctive. A brother who was a civil engineer. Parents who were both retired now and lived near the coast. A grandmother who, at 84, had apparently told Rios during her last visit that she was thinking of taking up kayaking. I thought about the 40-year-old report. The evolutionary pressure. The long, accumulated history of a species that had made difficulty into something they moved toward, rather than away from. I thought about a woman in her 80s thinking about taking up kayaking. I thought about the conclave's threat assessment, low, developing, not particularly remarkable. On my way back inside, I passed Owen Dale in the corridor. He was carrying a rolled-up set of building plans and talking on his communication device, but he nodded as he passed and said, "Good afternoon," with the absent friendliness of a person whose social instincts operated on a separate track from whatever else his mind was doing. I said good afternoon back. I went to my desk and I began to write, for the third and final time, the opening line of my report to the Zethari Council. I wrote, "I am going to tell you something that may at first appear to be a reassurance, but is, more accurately, a significant reorientation of how we think about one of the Conclave's newest member species, and I ask you to stay with me through all of it, because the conclusion is important and the path to it matters." I wrote for 6 hours. I stopped twice, once for food and once to walk around the courtyard. Because sitting that long without moving is not good for Zethari physiology. I used everything I had gathered, every fragment, every conversation, every page of the board report. I tried to be precise and honest, and to earn the conclusion I was building toward. The council would receive it the next day, through the standard relay. They would convene a discussion session, review my sources, and respond with questions or directives or both. This is the normal process. I expected the normal process. What I did not expect, and what still catches me off guard when I think about it now, is the response I received from the senior counselor, which came not through the official relay but through a private channel, and which arrived 12 hours after my report was filed. The message was brief. It said, "We have read your report in full. We have also read the Xenopsychology Board findings you attached. We are going to need some time with this. In the meantime, please continue your work as assigned and do not alarm the humans." I read that last line 3 times. Do not alarm the humans. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, exactly, but because there was something perfectly shaped about it. My government, upon receiving a 4,000-year-old report about a species whose civilian population performed above expectation on every threat-relevant metric, whose response to danger was cooperative and efficient and quick in a way that could not be explained by training alone, whose ordinary school teachers stepped forward in transit hubs without hesitation, and whose retired grandmothers were thinking about taking up kayaking. My government's instinct was to ask me not to alarm them. as though they were the ones who needed to be careful, as though the relevant risk was that a human might notice we were paying attention. I wrote back and said that I had no intention of alarming the humans and that I believed, based on all available evidence, that this was extremely wise counsel for reasons somewhat different from the ones my government probably had in mind. The senior counselor did not respond to that, which was also correct. I spent the rest of that evening sitting at my window, watching the city below. The lights were coming on across the buildings, warm and many-colored, and people were moving through the streets in the way they always did. Purposeful, varied, absorbed in the 10,000 individual concerns of ordinary life. A couple arguing cheerfully over something in a bag from a market stall. A child running ahead of the adults and being called back. A man in a reflective vest doing something with a piece of street infrastructure, apparently dissatisfied with whatever it was doing, leaning in to fix it. A group of young people sitting on the steps of a building, talking loudly and laughing about something I could not hear. None of them knew about the xenopsychology report. None of them knew about the Dreth delegation or the entrance corridor or the 67-page thread I had pulled from the archive about evolutionary adaptation under sustained multi-vector pressure. None of them knew that a room full of aliens had been quietly reconsidering everything it thought it knew about them. Based on the behavior of a schoolteacher, with a bag of groceries and a facilities technician who had been fixing a wall panel, they were just living their lives. Moving through their city. Doing the things they did, which were ordinary and also, in a way I was still learning the full shape of, quite extraordinary. I sat there for a long time. When I finally turned away from the window and went to prepare for the next day's work, I found myself thinking about what Rios had said. The situation becomes simple. Everything that isn't the problem stops mattering. I thought about a species that had spent its entire history inside a version of that feeling, and what you might become if difficulty was not the exception, but the weather you had always known, and what your ordinary people might look like to someone who had only ever seen the version of you that had been trained, selected, and refined. They had not shown the conclave their special forces first. They had not needed to. The ordinary ones were already more than enough to notice. I closed my notes and turned off the light and thought, as I did most nights now, that I was very glad to be their friend. And I thought, as I did not often let myself think too directly, that I was also very glad they had decided to be ours, because I had read the reports. I had seen the entrance corridor. I had watched Gordon Webb, a man who worked in materials supply, step forward in a transit hall with the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided, at some point long before that moment, what kind of person he was going to be. The conclave had a classification for species like that. They had just never expected to find it distributed this widely. End.